Before his birth, his mother dreamed she gave birth to a lion. Agariste woke in the darkness of an Athenian house, the vision still vivid, a beast of terrible power emerging from her body to stalk the streets of the city. The Greeks took such dreams seriously. Seers and relatives would have debated its meaning. Glory or destruction, greatness or catastrophe, perhaps all of these intertwined. The child born shortly afterward, around 495 BC, would fulfill the prophecy in ways that no interpreter could have predicted. His name was Pericles, and he would make Athens the center of the world. He entered life carrying the weight of two extraordinary bloodlines. His mother, Agareste, was a niece of Cleisthenes, the revolutionary who had dismantled aristocratic control and created the democratic system that now governed Athens. The Alcmaeonid clan to which she belonged had shaped Athenian history for generations, producing leaders, exiles, and reformers whose influence extended across the Greek world. But the family also bore a curse. Generations earlier, an Alcmaeonid had violated sanctuary and murdered suppliants, bringing a pollution upon the bloodline that enemies would invoke for centuries. Pericles would learn that greatness and suspicion could be inherited together. His father, Xanthippus, had earned fame through both politics and war. He had prosecuted Miltiades, the hero of Marathon, for a failed military expedition, a reminder that Athens held even its greatest men accountable. Later, Xanthippus himself commanded the Athenian fleet at the Battle of Mycale in 479 BC, helping to destroy the remnants of Persian naval power and liberate Greek cities along the Asian coast. The boy grew up in a household where political courage and military glory were expected rather than exceptional. The Athens of Pericles' childhood was a city transformed by crisis and triumph. He was too young to remember Marathon, where Athenian hoplites had shattered a Persian invasion force in 490 BC, but the battle's legacy surrounded him. Veterans walked the streets with the quiet confidence of men who had proven that Greeks could defeat the great king's armies. The city had built its identity around that single afternoon on a coastal plain, when citizen soldiers had accomplished what should have been impossible. The greater test came when Pericles was a teenager. In 480 BC, Xerxes led an invasion force so vast that ancient sources claimed it drank rivers dry. Athens faced annihilation. The city was evacuated, its population scattered to nearby islands and allied territories, while Persian soldiers occupied the abandoned streets and burned the temples on the Acropolis. The sacred olive tree of Athena, the ancient wooden statue of the goddess, the monuments that had defined Athenian identity, all were consumed by flames that could be seen for miles. Salamis reversed the catastrophe. The Athenian fleet, built through the foresight of the statesman Themistocles, trapped the Persian navy in the narrow straits and destroyed it, while Xerxes watched from a throne set up on the shore. The following year, at Plataea, a combined Greek army annihilated the Persian land forces that had remained behind. The invasion was over. Athens had been destroyed and reborn, emerging from the ashes with a confidence that would reshape the Mediterranean world. Pericles absorbed these events at the age when young men form their understanding of what is possible. He witnessed a democracy that had evacuated its entire population rather than surrender, that had risked everything on a naval strategy others considered madness, that had emerged victorious against the greatest empire the world had known. The lesson was profound. Bold leadership combined with popular commitment could achieve what cautious calculation would never attempt. His education prepared him to lead such a city. Aristocratic Athenian boys received training in music, poetry, athletics, and rhetoric, the skills that a citizen would need to participate in public life and, if talented enough, to dominate it. Pericles studied with masters whose names have survived the centuries. Damon of Oa taught him music, though the instruction went far beyond scales and melodies. Damon was a political theorist who used music as a cover for teaching the arts of persuasion and civic organization. The Athenians eventually grew suspicious enough to ostracize him, suggesting that they understood the true nature of his curriculum. Anaxagoras of Clazomenae shaped Pericles' mind more profoundly than any other teacher. This philosopher had arrived in Athens from Ionia, bringing with him a systematic approach to understanding the natural world that dispensed with traditional mythology. The sun was not a god, but a burning rock larger than the Peloponnese. The moon reflected light rather than generating it. Mind, nous, was the organizing principle of the cosmos, imposing order on primordial chaos through rational arrangement. These ideas were revolutionary, even dangerous. Anaxagoras would eventually face prosecution for impiety. But his student absorbed a worldview that valued reason over superstition, evidence over tradition, and calm analysis over emotional reaction. The influence showed in Pericles' emerging personality. Where other young aristocrats cultivated charm and spontaneity, he developed a reserve that observers found remarkable. He spoke rarely in public, saving his interventions for moments when they would carry maximum weight. He controlled his facial expressions, his gestures, his tone of voice with a discipline that seemed almost unnatural. When he did speak, his words were precise, his arguments structured, his conclusions seemingly inevitable. The young man was constructing himself as deliberately as an architect designs a temple. He also learned from the failures of others. Themistocles, the architect of Salamis, had been the most powerful man in Athens, until his arrogance and his enemies combined to destroy him. Ostracized, then accused of treason, he fled Greece entirely and ended his days as a pensioner of the Persian king he had defeated. The lesson was clear. Athenian democracy tolerated leadership, but punished anyone who seemed to reach for tyranny. The city that had expelled its kings 2 generations earlier remained vigilant against any man who accumulated too much power too visibly. Pericles observed and calculated. He would seek influence rather than office, persuasion rather than command. He would make himself indispensable without ever appearing to grasp for dominance. He would serve the democracy so faithfully that the democracy would choose to follow him. The strategy required patience measured in decades, but patience was among the virtues that his education had cultivated. His first recorded public appearance came in 472 BC, when he was in his early 20s. Aeschylus, the great tragedian, had written a play called The Persians, a drama depicting the Persian defeat at Salamis from the perspective of the Persian court, transforming recent history into theatrical art. Such productions required wealthy sponsors to fund the chorus, costumes, and training. Pericles served as chorigos, putting his family's resources behind a work that celebrated the victory his father had helped achieve. The play won first prize at the festival. The young sponsor had announced his arrival in Athenian public life by associating himself with the city's greatest triumph. The Athens he entered as a political figure was still processing the implications of its victory. The Persian threat had not disappeared. The great king still ruled a vast empire, and his satraps still governed Greek cities along the Asian coast. An alliance of Greek states, led by Athens, had formed to continue the war and liberate the remaining Greeks from Persian control. This Delian League, named for the island where its treasury was kept, had begun as a voluntary confederation. It was becoming something else. Athenian ships dominated the League's fleet. Athenian generals commanded its expeditions. Athenian interests increasingly determined its policies. States that had joined as allies were discovering that departure was not permitted, that their contributions were no longer voluntary, that Athens viewed the League as an instrument of its own power rather than a partnership among equals. The transformation from alliance to empire was underway, and the young Pericles watched carefully, learning how power accumulated and how it might be used. The city itself was rebuilding. The temples burned by the Persians had not been restored. Some Athenians believed that the ruins should stand as permanent reminders of barbarian sacrilege. But new construction rose elsewhere. Walls, harbours, public buildings that served practical purposes while asserting civic pride. The population grew as Athens' commercial importance attracted immigrants from across the Greek world. The fleet that had won at Salamis required constant maintenance and expansion, employing thousands of rowers, shipbuilders, and suppliers. Athens was becoming wealthy in ways that agriculture alone could never have provided. Pericles came of age in a city that was inventing itself anew. The democracy that Cleisthenes had created was still evolving, its institutions adapting to challenges that its founder could not have anticipated. The empire that the Persian Wars had made possible was still taking shape, its nature unclear even to those who were building it. The cultural flowering that would make Athens synonymous with civilization had not yet begun. The Parthenon was still a pile of charred rubble. The great tragedies were still unwritten. The philosophers who would define Western thought were still unborn. All of that lay ahead. In 470 BC, Pericles was a young aristocrat with a famous name, a superb education, and ambitions that he had learned to conceal behind a mask of dignified reserve. The city that had survived Persian fire was ready for leaders who could match its new confidence. The young man who had been prophesied as a lion was preparing to claim his place. The path to power in democratic Athens was neither straight nor safe, but Pericles had been studying that path since childhood, and he believed he understood how to walk it without falling. The Athens that Pericles entered as a young politician was a city drunk on its own success. The Persian Wars had revealed that Greek citizen soldiers and Greek triremes could defeat the greatest empire on earth. The Delian League had transformed Athenian naval power into an instrument of expansion, its fleets liberating Greek cities from Persian control, while binding them ever more tightly to Athenian leadership. Tribute flowed into treasuries. Trade enriched merchants who had once struggled for subsistence. The democracy that had gambled everything on wooden walls now reaped rewards beyond its founder's imagination. The dominant figure of this era was Cimon, son of Miltiades, the hero of Marathon. Where Pericles came from a family associated with democratic reform, Cimon represented the old aristocratic tradition, wealthy, generous, pro-Spartan, convinced that Athens' future lay in continued alliance with the conservative powers of Greece, rather than radical democracy at home. He used his personal fortune to fund public projects, opening his orchards to any citizen who wished to pick fruit, providing meals for the poor, paying for festivals that kept his name constantly before the people. His military record was impeccable. Victory after victory against Persian forces, expansion of Athenian influence throughout the Aegean, the kind of success that made criticism seem like ingratitude. Pericles understood that he could not challenge Cimon directly. The older man's popularity was too great, his achievements too recent, his resources too vast. Instead, the young politician attached himself to Ephialtes, a reformer whose democratic convictions ran deeper than tactical calculation. Ephialtes was incorruptible in an age when corruption was expected. passionate about expanding citizen participation and determined to break the power of institutions that still protected aristocratic privilege. He would become Pericles' mentor in the arts of democratic politics, and his fate would teach lessons that Pericles never forgot. Their target was the Areopagus, the ancient council that had once governed Athens before the democratic reforms. Composed of former archons who served for life, the Areopagus retained significant powers. It judged cases of homicide, guarded the laws, and exercised a vague supervisory authority over public morality that could be used to obstruct democratic initiatives. Its members were overwhelmingly aristocratic, its traditions conservative, its very existence a reminder that Athenian democracy remained incomplete. Ephialtes and Pericles began a systematic campaign to strip the Areopagus of its political powers and transfer them to democratic institutions. The opportunity came through Ciemon's miscalculation. In 462 BC, Sparta faced a massive revolt of its Helot population, the enslaved Greeks whose labor sustained Spartan society. The rebels had fortified themselves on Mount Ithome, and Sparta, whose army was designed for pitched battles rather than sieges, appealed to its allies for assistance. Cimon persuaded the Athenian assembly to send a force to help, arguing that Greeks should not allow Greeks to be defeated by slaves, that the Spartan alliance remained essential to Athenian security. The expedition ended in humiliation. The Spartans, suspicious of Athenian intentions, or perhaps simply contemptuous of their democratic politics, dismissed the Athenian force before it could accomplish anything. Cimon had promised that helping Sparta would strengthen the alliance. Instead, his policy had produced insult and embarrassment. The pro-Spartan faction that he led suddenly looked naive at best, treasonous at worst. Ephialtes and Pericles struck while their opponent was weakened. They pushed through reforms that gutted the Areopagus, transferring its powers to the popular assembly, the Council of 500, and the people's courts. The ancient body retained jurisdiction over homicide and religious matters, but its political influence was eliminated. Citizens who had once watched aristocrats deliberate on matters of state now held those powers themselves. The democracy had taken a radical step toward direct popular rule. Cimon attempted to reverse the reforms and found himself overwhelmed. The assembly voted to ostracize him, the peculiar Athenian practice of exiling a citizen for 10 years without charge or trial, simply because the people judged his presence dangerous to the state. The hero of a dozen campaigns, the son of Marathon's victor, walked out of Athens carrying only what he could hold, his political career seemingly destroyed by a single strategic error and the men who had exploited it. Then Ephialtes was murdered. The assassination occurred at night, the killers never conclusively identified. Some suspected oligarchic conspirators taking revenge for the Areopagus reforms. Others whispered that Pericles himself had arranged the death of a mentor who might have become a rival. The accusations were probably false. Pericles had no obvious motive, and the murder's timing hurt the democratic cause by removing its most effective advocate. But they revealed how quickly Athenian politics could turn lethal. Pericles found himself, at approximately 33 years old, the leading figure of the democratic faction. He had not sought the position through violence. It had fallen to him through his ally's death and his rival's exile, but he proved immediately ready to use it. The reforms he championed over the following years would complete the transformation of Athens into the most radically democratic state the ancient world had known. Payment for public service became the cornerstone of his democratic program. Previously, only wealthy citizens could afford to serve on juries, attend the assembly, or hold public office. The time required was simply too costly for men who needed to work for their living. Pericles introduced pay for jurors, then for other civic functions, enabling poor citizens to participate in governance without sacrificing their livelihoods. The change was revolutionary. Democracy ceased to be a theoretical right that only the privileged could exercise and became a practical reality for thousands of Athenians who had been excluded by their poverty. The courts expanded in scope and importance. Juries of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of citizens decided cases that ranged from property disputes to capital crimes. These massive panels could not be bribed or intimidated as easily as individual judges. Their decisions represented something approaching the collective judgment of the Athenian people. Pericles understood that legal power was political power, and he ensured that democratic institutions controlled both. The assembly became the true center of Athenian government. Citizens gathered on the Pnyx, a hill near the Acropolis, to debate and decide every significant question of policy. War and peace, taxation and expenditure, alliances and enmities, all required approval from the assembled people. Speakers rose to advocate positions, facing audiences that could shout them down or cheer them forward. The art of rhetoric, which Pericles had studied since childhood, became the essential skill of political leadership. A man who could persuade the assembly could shape Athens' destiny. A man who could not was politically irrelevant, regardless of his birth or wealth. Pericles proved to be the supreme master of this art. His speeches, reconstructed by later historians, combined logical argument with emotional appeal, practical calculation with visionary aspiration. He spoke rarely, building anticipation for his interventions. When he did address the assembly, his words carried weight that lesser speakers could not match. He never pandered or flattered. He treated the citizens as intelligent adults, capable of understanding complex issues and making difficult choices. The respect he showed them earned respect in return. His personal style reinforced his political message. He avoided the lavish displays that aristocrats like Cimon had used to build popular support. He attended no parties, accepted no dinner invitations, walked the same path between his home and the public spaces where business was conducted. The austerity was calculated. It demonstrated that he sought no personal advantage from his position, that his devotion was to the city rather than to himself. The Athenians, suspicious of anyone who seemed to enjoy power too much, found his restraint reassuring. By 461 BC, Pericles had emerged as Athens' most influential politician. He held no special office, commanded no military forces, possessed no formal authority beyond what any citizen possessed. Yet his voice in the assembly carried more weight than anyone else's. His proposals became policy. His judgment guided decisions that affected the entire Greek world. The democracy that had been created to prevent the concentration of power had produced a leader whose influence exceeded what many kings could claim. The transformation was not complete. Rivals remained, critics sharpened their attacks, and the assembly could always reject his counsel if he failed to persuade them. But the foundations of his dominance were now in place. He had helped destroy the last institutional obstacles to full democracy, while making himself indispensable to the system he had created. The restraint he displayed was genuine, but it was also strategic. The Athenians trusted him because he never seemed to grasp for more than they were willing to give. Athens itself was changing as rapidly as its politics. The Delian League had become an Athenian empire in all but name, its member states paying tribute that filled Athenian coffers, its military forces serving Athenian interests, its policies determined in Athenian assemblies, where no allied voice could be heard. The fleet that protected Greece from Persia now enforced Athenian will against anyone who challenged Athenian supremacy. The democracy that Pericles championed at home rested on an imperialism abroad that denied to others the freedom Athens claimed for itself. Pericles saw no contradiction. Athens was exceptional, its system superior, its leadership beneficial even to those who resented it. The tribute that allies paid purchased security they could not provide for themselves. The order that Athens imposed prevented the chaos that would otherwise consume the Greek world. The empire was not oppression, but civilization. Not tyranny, but the natural leadership of the most capable state over those less capable of governing themselves. Whether he believed these arguments or simply found them useful, he would repeat them for the rest of his life. The golden age he was about to create would be built on foundations that included both democratic ideals and imperial extraction. The tension between those elements would eventually tear Athens apart, but that reckoning lay decades in the future, invisible to a man who stood at the threshold of achievements that would define Western civilization. The politician had secured his position. Now the statesman would begin to build. Pericles governed Athens without governing it. He held the office of strategos, general, which the assembly elected annually, but so did 9 other men. He possessed no veto, no executive authority, no power to command except what persuasion could secure. Every policy he championed required approval from citizens who could reject his counsel as easily as they accepted it. Yet for more than 3 decades, his voice would guide Athens through its greatest triumphs and its most devastating failures. The democracy had created something unprecedented, a leader whose power rested entirely on his ability to articulate what the people wanted before they knew they wanted it. His leadership style reflected the lessons of his predecessors' failures. Themistocles had been brilliant but arrogant, accumulating enemies until they combined to destroy him. Cimon had been generous but politically blind, trusting Sparta until Sparta humiliated him. Ephialtes had been principled but vulnerable, his murder demonstrating that even reformers could fall to knives in the dark. Pericles would be none of these things. He would make himself useful rather than dominant, indispensable rather than resented, the servant of Athenian ambition rather than its master. The citizenship law of 451 BC revealed his understanding of how democracy could be both expanded and constrained. Previously, any child of an Athenian father was considered a citizen regardless of the mother's origin. Pericles proposed, and the assembly approved, a stricter requirement. Both parents must be Athenian citizens for their children to claim citizenship. The reform drew a sharper boundary around the community that possessed political rights, making Athenian identity more exclusive precisely as the benefits of that identity increased. The law served multiple purposes. It protected the privileges of citizens against dilution by immigrants attracted to Athens' growing prosperity. It reduced the number of potential claimants on public funds as payments for civic participation expanded. It strengthened the sense of Athenian exceptionalism that Pericles cultivated. Citizenship was not merely a legal status, but membership in a community defined by blood as well as residence. The democracy became more democratic for those inside it by becoming more restrictive about who could get in. Critics would later note the irony when Pericles' own son by Aspasia, a foreign woman, would require special exemption from the very law his father had championed. But that complication lay years in the future. In 451 BC, the law seemed a natural expression of Athenian confidence. the drawing of boundaries appropriate to a city that increasingly saw itself as unique among Greek states. The physical transformation of Athens proceeded alongside the legal reforms. The long walls became Pericles' most significant strategic project. Massive fortifications connecting the city to its port at Piraeus, creating a corridor that could not be severed by any land army. The walls meant that Athens could never be starved into submission as long as its fleet controlled the sea. Enemy armies might ravage the countryside, but the city itself would remain supplied through harbour facilities that no siege could reach. The strategy made Athens virtually invulnerable to the kind of warfare that other Greek states practiced, transforming Athenian naval power from an advantage into an absolute guarantee of survival. The construction employed thousands of citizens, providing wages that circulated through the economy, while creating infrastructure that would serve the city for generations. Pericles understood that public works served political as well as practical purposes. Men who earned their living building walls for the democracy developed a stake in the democracy's survival. The projects bound citizens to the state through economic interest as well as patriotic sentiment. The Delian League treasury moved from Delos to Athens in 454 BC, a transfer that marked the final transformation of alliance into empire. The official justification cited security concerns. Persian forces remained active in the eastern Mediterranean, and Delos was vulnerable to attack. The real reason was simpler. Athens wanted direct control over funds that had grown enormous through decades of tribute collection. The treasury that had been held in trust for the alliance now belonged to the city that had always dominated that alliance. The transfer provoked grumbling among allies who recognized its implications but lacked the power to resist. They paid their tribute because Athenian triremes would devastate any city that refused. They attended councils where their voices carried no weight, because decisions were made in Athens by Athenians who had no intention of sharing authority. The League had become a mechanism for extracting wealth from the Aegean world and depositing it in Athenian hands. Pericles made no apology for this arrangement. The treasury would fund projects that benefited all Greeks, he argued. Temples that honored shared gods, fleets that protected shared waters, culture that elevated shared civilization. If Athens administered these goods, it was because Athens alone possessed the capacity for such administration. The allies should be grateful rather than resentful. They were contributing to achievements that would outlast their petty grievances. Not everyone accepted this logic, and the years following the treasury's transfer brought challenges that tested Athenian power. The First Peloponnesian War had begun in 460 BC, pitting Athens against Sparta and its allies in conflicts that flared across Greece. Simultaneously, Athens had dispatched a massive expedition to Egypt, supporting a revolt against Persian rule that promised to extend Athenian influence to the Nile. The city was fighting on multiple fronts, its resources stretched thin by ambitions that exceeded any previous Greek state's reach. The Egyptian expedition ended in catastrophe. After initial successes, the Athenian force found itself trapped in the Nile Delta, its fleet destroyed, its army annihilated. Perhaps 50,000 men, Athenians and allies, perished in a disaster that revealed the limits of naval power when extended too far from home. The defeat shocked Athens, demonstrating that the invincibility cultivated since Salamis was an illusion that distant enemies could shatter. Pericles drew lessons from the catastrophe that would shape his strategy for decades. Athens was powerful, but not omnipotent. Its strength lay in the Aegean, not in distant adventures. The fleet that dominated Greek waters could not project comparable force to Egypt or beyond. Future policy should consolidate existing gains, rather than chase new conquests that might produce new disasters. The war with Sparta ground on without decisive result. Both sides won battles and lost them, captured cities and abandoned them, exhausted resources without achieving the victory that might have justified the expenditure. By 446 BC, all parties were ready for peace. The 30 years' peace that Pericles negotiated recognized the division of the Greek world into two spheres. Sparta dominated the Peloponnese and its land-based allies. Athens controlled the Aegean and its naval empire. Neither side would interfere with the other's domain. The treaty was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but preserved what both sides valued most. Sparta retained its hegemony over traditional allies. Athens kept its empire intact. The ideological conflict between oligarchy and democracy, between land power and sea power, remained unresolved but was temporarily suspended. Greece would have a generation of peace, or something close to it, in which to develop along the divergent paths that geography and history had established. Pericles emerged from these years, with his position strengthened rather than weakened. He had guided Athens through crises that might have destroyed lesser leaders, maintaining democratic support even when policies failed. The Egyptian disaster had not been his initiative. He had counseled against overextension, and he benefited from the contrast between his caution and others' recklessness. The peace with Sparta reflected his understanding that Athens needed time to consolidate, that the empire required internal development rather than endless expansion. The democracy he had helped create now functioned as he had designed it. Citizens served on juries, attended assemblies, held offices that rotated through the population. Public pay enabled broad participation. The courts enforced laws that applied to rich and poor alike. The assembly decided questions of war and peace, taxation and expenditure, with a directness that no other Greek state approached. Athens had become the proof that ordinary men could govern themselves, that expertise and wisdom were not monopolies of the well-born. Yet the system depended on leadership that the system itself could not guarantee. Democratic institutions made decisions, but someone had to frame the choices, articulate the options, persuade the assembly to choose wisely rather than foolishly. Pericles filled that role so completely that it became difficult to imagine Athenian democracy without him. The city that had rejected kings and tyrants had found something else. A first citizen whose influence derived from his ability to express what Athens wanted to be. He was approaching 50, his hair graying, his reputation secure, his enemies temporarily silenced. The democracy was established. The empire was stable. The peace with Sparta provided the breathing room that ambitious projects required. Pericles began to consider what Athens might become if its resources were devoted not to warfare, but to creation, if the wealth extracted from the Aegean world was transformed into monuments that would endure for millennia. The Golden Age was about to begin. The Acropolis had stood as a ruin for a generation. Persian fires had consumed the temples that once crowned Athens' sacred rock, leaving behind charred columns and shattered sanctuaries that some citizens believed should remain as eternal testimony to barbarian sacrilege. But Pericles saw in the ruins not a memorial, but an opportunity. The wealth flowing into Athens from its empire could transform destruction into creation, replacing what the Persians had burned with monuments so magnificent that they would proclaim Athenian greatness until the end of time. The building program he proposed was unprecedented in scale and ambition. The Parthenon would rise as the supreme temple to Athena. goddess and protector of the city. The propylaea would create a monumental gateway to the sacred precinct. Subsidiary temples, shrines, and civic buildings would complete a complex designed to overwhelm visitors with beauty and awe. The cost would be staggering, thousands of talents extracted from the treasury that nominally belonged to the Delian League. The result would be civilization's most enduring statement of what human hands could achieve. Opposition materialized immediately. Thucydides, son of Milesius, not the historian, but an aristocratic politician who had become Pericles' most formidable rival, denounced the project as corruption and tyranny. The treasury existed to defend Greece against Persia, he argued, not to gild Athens with stolen money. The allies who paid tribute would see their contributions transformed into Athenian temples, while their own cities remained modest. Greece would conclude that Athens had become a tyrant city, adorning itself like a vain woman with jewelry purchased through extortion. Pericles answered with arguments that revealed his understanding of power and its justifications. Athens provided security. Athens deserved compensation. The allies paid money rather than providing ships and soldiers. How Athens used that money was Athens' concern alone. If the city chose to honor the gods and employ its citizens through magnificent construction, no one outside Athens had standing to object. The defense was breathtakingly cynical, and the assembly accepted it because the assembly wanted the buildings as much as Pericles did. The contest between Pericles and Thucydides continued for years, each man rallying supporters, each attacking the other's policies, each seeking the decisive moment when popular favor would tip irreversibly. In 443 BC, that moment arrived. The assembly voted to ostracize one of them, and Thucydides drew the shorter lot. The aristocratic critic walked into exile, leaving Pericles without a serious rival for the first time in his career. The building program would proceed without organized opposition. Phidias became the artistic director of Pericles' vision, a sculptor whose genius matched the ambition of his patron. He had already created the colossal bronze Athena that stood on the Acropolis, visible to sailors approaching Piraeus, her spear tip catching sunlight like a beacon. Now he would oversee everything: the Parthenon's sculptural program, the ivory and gold statue of Athena that would stand within it, the integration of architecture and art into a unified expression of Athenian identity. The Parthenon rose over 15 years of labor that employed thousands of Athenians. Stonecutters shaped marble blocks with precision that modern engineers still struggle to explain. Sculptors carved friezes depicting the Panathenaic procession, ordinary Athenians participating in the festival that honored their goddess. Democracy itself rendered in stone. The building's columns employed subtle curves and variations that created an impression of organic perfection. Nothing was quite straight, because perfectly straight lines would have appeared lifeless to the human eye. Every detail reflected a sophistication that transformed construction into art. The Athena Parthenos that Phidias created for the temple's interior was among the ancient world's most celebrated works. Standing nearly 40 feet tall, constructed of ivory for flesh and gold for clothing, the statue depicted the goddess in full armor, with Nike, the personification of victory, resting in her outstretched hand. The gold alone weighed over a ton, a fortune that could have funded years of military campaigns, transformed into religious art that proclaimed Athens' devotion to its divine protector. The building projects achieved what Pericles had intended beyond their religious purpose. They provided employment for citizens who might otherwise have found peacetime prosperity elusive. Carpenters, metalworkers, painters, transporters. and laborers of every description found wages in the service of civic construction. The money that flowed through these projects circulated through the economy, enriching merchants and craftsmen whose prosperity bound them ever more tightly to the political system that had created it. Athens became the cultural capital of the Greek world through more than architecture. The tragic playwrights, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, produced works that explored the deepest questions of human existence before audiences of thousands. The comedies of Aristophanes subjected politicians, philosophers, and public policy to ridicule that would have been dangerous in any less confident society. Historians like Herodotus gathered in Athens to share research and debate interpretations. Philosophers established schools that would shape Western thought for millennia. The city had become a magnet for talent, a place where ambitious minds came to test themselves against the best competition available. Aspasia entered Pericles' life during these years of triumph, and her presence would complicate his reputation in ways that revealed the limits of Athenian tolerance. She came from Miletus, a Greek city in Asia Minor, which meant she could never be an Athenian citizen and could never be Pericles' legal wife. Their relationship defied convention. She was his partner in everything but law, the mother of his youngest son, and according to hostile sources, the author of his speeches and the true power behind his policies. The attacks on Aspasia reflected both misogyny and political calculation. Pericles' enemies could not easily strike at a man so firmly established in popular favor, but they could wound him through those he loved. Aspasia was prosecuted for impiety. The charge was probably pretextual, designed to embarrass Pericles rather than punish genuine offense. He defended her before the jury personally, reportedly weeping as he pleaded for her acquittal. The tears shocked observers who had never seen emotion crack his famous reserve. Aspasia was acquitted, but the prosecution had demonstrated that even Pericles' household was not beyond attack. Phidias faced similar treatment. Accused of embezzling gold intended for the Athena Parthenos, he was put on trial, despite having demonstrably incorporated all the gold into the statue in a way that allowed it to be removed and weighed. The charge was transparently political, enemies striking at Pericles through his collaborator. Phidias either died in prison or fled into exile, depending on which ancient source one credits. Either way, the greatest artist of the age was destroyed by a prosecution aimed at his patron. Anaxagoras, the philosopher who had shaped Pericles' mind, also faced prosecution for impiety. His teachings about the sun being a burning rock rather than a god offended traditional believers, or provided a convenient excuse for those who wanted to hurt Pericles by hurting his teacher. Anaxagoras left Athens rather than face trial, dying in exile from the city that had been his home for decades. The prosecutions revealed a pattern. Pericles himself was too popular to attack directly, but those around him could be targeted with accusations that reflected on his judgment and associations. These attacks could not slow the transformation that Pericles had set in motion. By 440 BC, Athens had become something without precedent in human history. A democracy of unprecedented participation, an empire of unprecedented reach, a cultural center of unprecedented brilliance. The Parthenon dominated the Acropolis, visible for miles, proclaiming to every visitor that this city had achieved what no city had achieved before. The theatres produced works that would be performed for millennia. The courts dispensed justice according to laws that citizens themselves had made. The assembly governed an empire that stretched across the Aegean. Pericles stood at the summit of this achievement, the man most responsible for its creation, the voice that had articulated its meaning. He was in his mid-50s, his position apparently unassailable, his city apparently invincible. The golden age that later generations would name for him was not an abstraction, but a lived reality. Stone temples rising against blue sky, dramatic choruses echoing through crowded theatres, citizens debating the fate of nations in assemblies where every voice could be heard. But the same empire that funded the Parthenon generated resentments that peaceful years could not dissolve. The allies who paid for Athenian glory wanted that glory to end. The rivals who watched Athenian power expand wanted that power contained. And Sparta, which had accepted the 30 years' peace as a temporary expedient, was beginning to conclude that Athens would never stop growing unless someone stopped it. The golden light was about to cast darker shadows. The revolt of Samos in 440 BC reminded Athens that empire required constant maintenance. Samos was not a tribute-paying subject, but one of the few remaining allies that contributed ships rather than money, retaining a measure of autonomy that most league members had long since lost. When a dispute with neighboring Miletus provided the pretext, Samos attempted to break free entirely, overthrowing the democratic government Athens had imposed and defying the power that claimed to lead the Greek world. Pericles commanded the fleet that sailed to crush the rebellion. The campaign lasted 9 months, far longer than anyone had anticipated, and required multiple naval battles before Samian resistance finally collapsed. The terms imposed on the defeated city were harsh. The walls came down, the fleet was surrendered, an enormous indemnity was assessed, and hostages were taken to ensure future compliance. The lesson was clear to every state in the Aegean. Rebellion would be punished, independence was not an option, and Athens would pay whatever price necessary to maintain its dominion. The Samian War demonstrated both the strength and the fragility of Athenian power. The strength was obvious. No single state could resist Athenian naval superiority, and even a prolonged revolt by a major ally ended in total defeat. The fragility was subtler, but equally real. The campaign had required resources that might have been used elsewhere, had exposed the bitterness that subject states felt toward their imperial master, and had shown potential enemies that Athens could be tied down by determined resistance. Sparta had reportedly debated whether to intervene on Samos's behalf. The decision against intervention was narrow and might go differently next time. Relations with Sparta deteriorated through the 400s and 30s in a pattern that seemed designed to produce catastrophe. Neither side wanted war. The costs would be enormous, the outcome uncertain, the destruction widespread. But neither side could accept the conditions that might have preserved peace. Athens continued expanding its influence in ways that Sparta interpreted as aggression. Sparta supported states that resisted Athenian pressure in ways that Athens interpreted as interference. Each response to a perceived provocation became a provocation itself, tightening a spiral that diplomacy seemed unable to break. The crisis over Corcyra brought the rivals to the edge of open conflict. Corcyra possessed the second largest navy in Greece, and its allegiance could shift the balance of power decisively. When Corcyra's dispute with Corinth, Sparta's most important ally, threatened to draw in outside powers, both Athens and Sparta faced impossible choices. Athens could not allow Corcyra's fleet to fall into enemy hands. Sparta could not abandon Corinth without undermining the alliance system that sustained its position. In 433 BC, Athens formed a defensive alliance with Corcyra, and Athenian ships fought alongside Corcyrian vessels against Corinthian forces in a battle that stopped just short of being a formal act of war. Potidaea pushed the situation further toward the breaking point. This city in the northern Aegean was an Athenian tributary, but also a Corinthian colony, maintaining ties to its mother city that Athens found threatening. When Athens demanded that Potidæa tear down its walls, dismiss its Corinthian magistrates, and provide hostages, the city revolted instead, receiving support from Corinth that amounted to unofficial war against Athenian interests. The siege that followed consumed Athenian resources, while Corinthian anger hardened into demands that Sparta act against the city that was strangling Greek liberty. The Megarian decree became the most controversial of Pericles' policies in these dangerous years. Megara was a small state bordering Athenian territory, strategically positioned to threaten Athens if it fell under hostile influence. In response to perceived Megarian offences, Pericles proposed, and the assembly enacted, a decree excluding Megarian merchants from all ports in the Athenian Empire. The economic warfare was devastating to a trading city that depended on Aegean commerce. Megara appealed to Sparta for relief, adding its grievance to the growing list of complaints that Sparta's allies pressed their hegemon to address. Sparta's ultimatum arrived in 432 BC. Athens must lift the Megarian decree, free the Greek cities it held in subjection, and respect the autonomy that the 30 Years' Peace had supposedly guaranteed. The demands were impossible to accept without surrendering everything that made Athens powerful. The Athenian Empire existed precisely because allied cities were not autonomous. The Megarian decree expressed Athens' determination to use economic weapons against potential enemies. Accepting Sparta's terms would mean dismantling the system that funded the Parthenon, paid the jurors, and maintained the fleet. Pericles advised defiance. In a speech that Thucydides preserved or reconstructed from memory, he laid out the strategic calculation that would guide Athens through the coming war. The city should not seek battle on land, where Spartan infantry was superior. It should withdraw behind the long walls, abandon the countryside to enemy devastation, and rely on naval power to maintain supplies and strike at enemy coasts. Time favored Athens. The empire's tribute would fund prolonged warfare, while Sparta's allies would eventually tire of campaigns that produced no decisive results. If Athens held its nerve and avoided catastrophic mistakes, it would emerge from the war with its power intact. The strategy was rational, but required sacrifices that tested the limits of democratic commitment. Farmers would watch their fields burned, their olive trees cut down, their houses destroyed, and would be expected to accept these losses as the price of ultimate victory. Citizens who owned land in Attica would see their wealth devastated, while citizens who earned wages in the city or served in the fleet suffered relatively little. The burdens of war would fall unequally, and the assembly would need to maintain support for a strategy that demanded patience from people whose property was being systematically destroyed. Pericles believed the Athenians were capable of such discipline. He had spent decades educating them in the long-term thinking that democratic deliberation required, had demonstrated through his own example that restraint and calculation produced better results than impulse and aggression. The city that had followed his guidance through crises and triumphs would follow him through war, or so he believed. The final Spartan embassy arrived in the winter of 432 BC with a message stripped of diplomatic complexity. Sparta wants peace. Peace is possible if you give the Greeks their freedom. The demand was propaganda as much as policy. Sparta's own allies were hardly free, and Spartan intervention in other states' affairs was no less heavy-handed than Athenian. But the message resonated with Greeks who had come to see Athens as a tyrant city, gorgeous in its monuments but oppressive in its methods. Pericles' response defined the choice in terms that left no room for compromise. Concession would invite further demands. Showing weakness would encourage aggression. Accepting Spartan dictation would end Athenian independence as surely as military defeat. "If we do go to war," he reportedly told the assembly, "do not imagine that you are fighting over a small matter. If you yield this point, you will immediately be confronted with some greater demand, since they will think that you yielded this point through fear." The assembly voted for war. After 14 years of peace, less than half the 30 years the treaty had promised, Athens and Sparta would fight again. This time the conflict would continue until one side or the other was destroyed. Pericles had shaped the strategy that Athens would follow. He had articulated the reasoning that justified resistance. He had prepared the city as much as any city could be prepared for an ordeal whose duration and intensity no one could predict. Now he would discover whether his calculations were correct, whether democratic citizens could sustain the discipline he demanded, whether the empire he had built could survive the war that empire had made inevitable. He was 63 years old. The golden age he had created was about to be tested by fire. The Spartan army crossed into Attica in the early summer of 431 BC, and the smoke rising from burning farmhouses announced that the war Pericles had prepared for had finally arrived. King Archidamus led perhaps 60,000 men, the largest Greek army ever assembled, through countryside that Athenian farmers had cultivated for generations. They cut down olive trees that had taken decades to mature, burned granaries filled with the previous year's harvest, and systematically destroyed everything that could sustain human life outside the city walls. Athens did not resist. Following Pericles' strategy, the rural population had withdrawn behind the long walls, abandoning their homes to the invaders while preserving themselves for the prolonged struggle ahead. The city swelled with refugees who crowded into every available space: temples, public buildings, the narrow corridors between the walls connecting Athens to Piraeus. Conditions that would have been uncomfortable in peacetime became suffocating as the population of Attica compressed itself into a fraction of its normal territory. Pericles kept the army inside the walls despite the clamor for action. Young men who had never tested themselves in battle demanded the chance to defend their homeland. Older men who remembered Marathon argued that Athenians should not cower while enemies ravaged their fields. The assembly grew restless, then angry, as weeks passed, and the strategy that Pericles had promised would bring victory seemed to produce only humiliation. He held firm. The Spartans could destroy property, but could not take the city. They would eventually exhaust their supplies and withdraw. Patience would accomplish what courage could not. The Spartans withdrew after about 40 days, their army unable to sustain itself indefinitely in hostile territory. The first year of war ended without the decisive battle that both sides had expected. Athens remained intact, its fleet dominant, its empire still paying tribute. The strategy had worked, but the fields of Attica lay ruined, and the citizens who had watched their inheritance burn would not easily forgive the leader who had forbidden them to fight. That winter, Athens buried its war dead, with ceremonies that tradition prescribed for fallen soldiers. The bones of those who had died in the year's campaigns were gathered by tribe and displayed for public mourning. A funeral procession carried them to the public cemetery in the Ceramicus, where they would rest among the heroes of earlier generations. And a speaker chosen for his wisdom and eloquence delivered an oration honoring the dead while inspiring the living to continue their sacrifice. Pericles gave the funeral oration of 431 BC, and the speech, preserved or perhaps recreated by Thucydides, became the most famous articulation of democratic ideals the ancient world produced. He spoke not primarily of the dead, but of the city for which they had died, describing an Athens that represented the highest achievement of human political organization. Our constitution does not copy the laws of neighboring states, he declared. We are rather a pattern to others than imitators ourselves. Its administration favors the many instead of the few. This is why it is called a democracy. The words announced a revolutionary claim that ordinary citizens were capable of governing themselves, that wisdom was not the monopoly of the well-born, that a community of equals could achieve what aristocracies and tyrannies could not. He described an Athens where poverty was no barrier to public service, where men were judged by their merit rather than their class, where the law provided equal justice to all. Citizens participated in politics not as a burden, but as a natural expression of their humanity. We alone regard a man who takes no interest in public affairs, not as harmless, but as useless. The democracy demanded engagement. Withdrawal into private life was a kind of civic death. The cultural achievements that made Athens the school of Greece received their due. We cultivate refinement without extravagance, and knowledge without effeminacy. The city that had built the Parthenon and staged the tragedies of Sophocles had demonstrated that democratic citizens could create beauty as successfully as they could wage war. Athens did not choose between martial virtue and cultural sophistication. It excelled at both. The speech concluded with a challenge to the living. The dead had given everything for Athens. The survivors must prove worthy of that sacrifice. For this offering of their lives, made in common by them all, they each individually received that renown which never grows old, and for a sepulchre, not so much that in which their bones have been deposited, but that noblest of shrines wherein their glory is laid up to be eternally remembered. The funeral oration presented an idealized Athens that critics then and later would argue never existed. The democracy excluded women, relied on slaves, and ruled an empire whose subjects enjoyed none of the freedoms Pericles celebrated. But the ideal itself, the vision of a community where citizens governed themselves through reason and deliberation, would shape political thought for millennia. Whatever Athens actually was, Pericles had described what it aspired to become. The second year of war began with renewed Spartan invasion, renewed Athenian withdrawal, renewed destruction of crops and property. But this year brought something worse than enemy armies, a plague that entered through Piraeus and spread through the overcrowded population with a mortality that no military defeat could have matched. The disease, its precise nature still debated by modern scholars, killed with terrifying efficiency. Victims developed fevers that consumed them from within, their bodies breaking down over days of agony that no treatment could relieve. The sick filled temples where they had sought divine help. The dead accumulated faster than the living could bury them. Perhaps a quarter of Athens' population perished, possibly more. The city that had withdrawn behind its walls to avoid Spartan spears found itself trapped with an enemy that walls could not exclude. Pericles' strategy had created the conditions that made the plague catastrophic. The overcrowding that resulted from evacuating Attica into the city provided the disease with victims packed too closely together to escape infection. The same walls that protected against military assault imprisoned a population with a pestilence that spread through every crowded space. Citizens who had accepted Pericles' counsel now died because of it, and those who survived looked for someone to blame. The assembly turned on its leader with the ferocity that Athenian democracy reserved for those who had failed it. Pericles was prosecuted, convicted, and fined, a humiliation that would have destroyed lesser men. He was removed from the generalship he had held for decades, his strategic authority stripped away at the moment when steady leadership mattered most. The citizens who had followed him through 30 years of growth and triumph now rejected him in the hour of catastrophe. The plague took his sons, Xanthippus and Pericles, legitimate heirs who would have carried his name and continued his line. Both died in the epidemic that was consuming Athens. Pericles, who had maintained his famous reserve through decades of political combat, was seen weeping as he placed the funeral wreath on Pericles' body. The private man who had hidden behind the public statesman finally emerged, broken by losses that no philosophy could rationalize. He had one son remaining, the boy he had fathered with Aspasia, illegitimate under the citizenship law that Pericles himself had championed. In normal circumstances, this child could never have been an Athenian citizen, could never have inherited his father's political legacy, could never have been anything but a permanent reminder of the contradiction between Pericles' public policies and private life. The assembly, recognizing the cruelty of enforcing against Pericles a law he had created, granted a special exemption. The younger Pericles would be enrolled as a citizen, his father's line preserved through the very exception that proved the rule's severity. The Athenians recalled Pericles to the generalship as quickly as they had removed him. The alternatives were worse: demagogues who promised easy victories, leaders who lacked his strategic understanding, politicians who would squander what remained of Athenian strength in futile gestures. The man they had blamed for the plague was also the man they needed to survive it. He resumed his position, but his health had been broken by the same disease that had killed his sons. He continued to counsel the strategy he had always advocated: patience, discipline, faith that Athenian resources would outlast Spartan determination. He warned against the adventures and expansions that would tempt a democracy hungry for decisive action. He reminded the assembly that they were fighting not for conquest, but for survival, that victory meant preserving what they had, rather than grasping for more. The advice reflected the lessons of a lifetime spent studying how democracies failed. Through overreach, through impatience, through the seductive voices of leaders who promised more than reality could deliver. But his time for teaching had nearly ended. The plague that had killed so many Athenians had not spared their greatest leader. Pericles fell ill in the autumn of 429 BC, his body weakened by age, grief, and the exhaustion of 2 years of war. The man who had built the Golden Age would not see how the war he had started would end. His final days approached with the quietness he had cultivated throughout his life. Friends gathered around his bed as the fever consumed what remained of his strength. These were men who had served with him for decades: generals, politicians, philosophers, who had shared the project of making Athens great. They spoke among themselves of his achievements, cataloguing the victories and monuments and reforms as if reviewing a ledger that would soon be closed. Pericles lay silent, his eyes closed, and they assumed he could no longer hear them. They were wrong. When they had finished their inventory of his greatness, the dying man stirred. "You have praised me for things that many others have accomplished," he said, "and that fortune played a part in achieving. But you have not mentioned what I am most proud of, that no Athenian ever put on mourning clothes because of me." The words captured something essential about how Pericles understood his own legacy: the military victories, the architectural marvels, the expansion of democratic participation. All of these could be attributed, partly, to circumstances beyond any individual's control. But the restraint that had marked his exercise of power, the refusal to use his influence for personal vengeance or arbitrary punishment, the discipline that kept democratic politics from degenerating into factional bloodshed, these were choices that reflected character rather than fortune. He had held more power than any Athenian since the tyrants, and he had not abused it. In a city where political defeat often meant exile or death, no family had lost a member to Pericles' ambition. He died in the autumn of 429 BC, approximately 66 years old, having dominated Athenian politics for more than 3 decades. The plague that killed him had already killed thousands of his fellow citizens, including his legitimate sons, and would continue killing until it had reshaped the city's demographics and psychology. Athens buried Pericles with the honors due to a leader who had made it the greatest power in Greece. But the mourning was muted by the ongoing catastrophe that left little energy for ceremony. Thucydides, the historian who would chronicle the war that Pericles had started, offered an assessment that has shaped understanding of both the man and his era ever since. Athens under Pericles, Thucydides wrote, was in name a democracy, but was becoming, in fact, government by the first citizen. The observation was not criticism, but analysis. Pericles had made democratic institutions function through his personal authority, guiding the assembly toward decisions that his wisdom and theirs recognized as correct. The system worked because he worked within it, using persuasion rather than coercion, accepting that his proposals could be rejected, even as rejection became increasingly rare. When he saw them unreasonably confident, Thucydides continued, his words would reduce them to fear, and when they were discouraged without reason, he would restore their confidence. It was in name a democracy, but in fact rule by the foremost man. The double edge of the assessment cut both ways. Pericles had made democracy function at its highest level, but his success raised questions about whether democracy could function without him. The answer came swiftly and brutally. Athens after Pericles lurched from crisis to crisis, its assembly swayed by speakers who lacked his judgment, his restraint, his ability to subordinate short-term passions to long-term strategy. Cleon rose to prominence through a populism that Pericles had always avoided, attacking the wealthy, demanding harsher treatment of rebellious allies, promising victories that aggressive policies would somehow deliver. The discipline Pericles had cultivated dissolved in the heat of democratic deliberation, unconstrained by his steadying presence. The war ground on for 27 years after Pericles' death, consuming resources and lives at rates that made his cautious strategy seem wise in retrospect. The Athenians proved incapable of the patience he had demanded. They sought decisive victories rather than accepting the slow accumulation of advantage. They listened to leaders who told them what they wanted to hear rather than what they needed to know. They made the mistakes he had warned against, and they paid the price he had predicted. The Sicilian expedition of 415 to 413 BC represented the catastrophic abandonment of everything Pericles had taught. Athens dispatched the largest armada in its history to conquer Syracuse, a city on the far side of the Greek world whose subjugation would supposedly secure Athenian dominance forever. The expedition was precisely the kind of reckless gamble Pericles had counseled against: overextension of naval power into distant waters, commitment of resources that could not be replaced, strategic adventurism driven by ambition rather than calculation. The expedition ended in total annihilation. The Athenian fleet was destroyed in the harbour of Syracuse. The army that had accompanied it was hunted down and killed or enslaved in the quarries where survivors were imprisoned. Perhaps 50,000 men, the core of Athenian military strength, perished in a disaster that dwarfed the Egyptian expedition of a half-century earlier. The empire that Pericles had built and defended began to crumble as subject states recognized that Athenian power had been broken. Athens fought on for another 9 years, demonstrating resilience that astonished its enemies. The fleet was rebuilt. Allies who had revolted were reconquered. Battles were won that should have been impossible. But the resources were exhausted, the manpower depleted, the margin for error eliminated. In 404 BC, Sparta and its allies finally achieved the victory they had sought for nearly 3 decades. Athens surrendered, its long walls torn down, its fleet reduced to 12 ships, its empire dissolved, its democracy temporarily replaced by an oligarchy that Spartan arms imposed. The city that Pericles had led at the height of its power had been humbled beyond anything he could have imagined. The walls he had built to guarantee Athenian security lay in ruins. The tribute that had funded the Parthenon no longer flowed. The democratic institutions he had strengthened survived. The oligarchy lasted only a year before the democracy was restored. But the confidence that had characterized the Golden Age never fully returned. Athens would remain an important city, a cultural center, a symbol of what Greek civilization had achieved. It would never again be the dominant power of the Greek world. Yet the legacy Pericles had created proved more durable than the empire he had lost. The ideals he had articulated in the funeral oration, democracy, equality before the law, the dignity of the citizen, the responsibility of public engagement, outlasted the specific institutions that had embodied them. When later generations sought models for self-government, they looked to Athens. When philosophers debated the best form of political organization, they grappled with questions Athenian democracy had raised. When revolutionaries in America and France sought to overthrow monarchies and establish republics, they invoked precedents that traced back to the assembly on the Pnyx. The Parthenon endured as well. The temple that Pericles had built to honor Athena and glorify her city survived the war, survived centuries of subsequent conquest and conversion, survived transformation into a Christian church and then a Muslim mosque, survived Venetian bombardment that detonated Ottoman ammunition stored within its walls. Even in ruin, it remained the most recognized symbol of classical civilization, proof that human hands could create beauty that transcended the circumstances of its creation. The cultural achievements of the Golden Age proved equally permanent. The tragedies of Sophocles and Euripides continued to be performed, their explorations of fate and freedom, justice and revenge, as compelling to modern audiences as to ancient ones. The historical method that Thucydides developed, evidence-based, analytical, skeptical of supernatural explanation, became the foundation of Western historical practice. The philosophical questions that Socrates raised in Athenian streets during Pericles' lifetime would be developed by Plato and Aristotle into systems that shaped thought for millennia. Pericles himself became a symbol as much as a historical figure. Later ages saw in him what they wanted to see: the enlightened statesman, the democratic leader, the patron of culture, the imperial architect. Critics emphasized the gap between his rhetoric and reality, the slaves and women excluded from his democracy, the subjects oppressed by his empire. Admirers emphasized the achievements that made Athens the school of Greece, the innovations in self-government that subsequent civilizations would build upon. Both perspectives captured something true about a man whose complexity defied simple judgment. He had been born into a family that carried both prestige and curse, had been educated by philosophers who taught him to think beyond convention, had risen to power through institutions he helped to create, had built monuments that still stand, and articulated ideals that still inspire. He had also led an empire that extracted wealth from unwilling subjects, had started a war that killed tens of thousands and ended in defeat, had created a political system so dependent on his judgment that it struggled to function without him. The contradictions were real, and they resist resolution. Pericles was both the champion of democratic ideals and the architect of imperial exploitation. He was both the voice of Athenian greatness and the leader whose strategy failed to prevent Athenian catastrophe. He was both the philosopher-statesman who refused to abuse his power and the politician who prosecuted rivals and manipulated assemblies. History offers no clean verdict because the evidence supports no clean verdict. What remains is what he built, in stone, in institution, in idea. The Acropolis still rises above Athens, the Parthenon crowning its summit as it has for nearly 25 centuries. The democratic principles he championed still shape debates about how societies should govern themselves. The conviction that ordinary citizens can deliberate wisely about public affairs, that culture and politics need not be enemies, that power can be exercised with restraint. These beliefs found their most eloquent expression in his words and their most compelling demonstration in his career. Evening light falls across the marble columns as it fell when Pericles walked these streets, when the democracy he shaped gathered to decide the fate of their city, when Athens stood at the center of the world it had made. The tourists who crowd the Acropolis today speak languages he never heard, come from nations he never imagined, carry technologies that would have seemed like magic to his age. But they come to see what he built, drawn by a beauty and a meaning that time has not diminished. The stones endure, the ideas endure, and somewhere in the space between what Pericles achieved and what he failed to achieve, between the golden age he created and the war that ended it, lies the complicated truth of a man who shaped history more profoundly than almost anyone who has ever lived. He wanted to be remembered for the harm he did not do. History remembers him for everything else as well: the glory and the cost, the vision and the blindness, the democracy and the empire. The man who built Athens' golden age rests now in a grave whose location has been lost. But his city still stands, and his words still echo, and the arguments he started have never been resolved. The Acropolis at sunset, stone against sky. The work of human hands outlasting the hands that made it. This is what Pericles left behind.